Welcome to the Zombie Story Zone, where the dead walk and survival is never guaranteed. Today, we're diving into another thrilling tale of terror and suspense. Apocalypse on the frontier, pioneers face the undead in the Wild West. Before we get started, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the story. Your support keeps these chilling tales coming. And if you know someone who loves a good zombie thriller, share the video with them. We've got plenty more horrors lurking in the shadows just waiting to be unleashed. Now, brace yourself for a spine-tingling journey into a time where lawmen and pioneers face an unimaginable evil. Let's jump into the story.
The year was 1878, and the frontier towns of the American West were like islands in an ocean of wilderness, isolated, dangerous, and filled with uncertainty. While most folks were concerned about outlaws, hostile tribes, or hunger, no one in the town of Red Mesa, New Mexico, had ever imagined the dead would rise from their graves. Nestled between the scrubby desert and the jagged cliffs of the Sierra Madre, Red Mesa was a haven for weary travelers and settlers looking to carve out a life in the wilderness. The town's dusty streets, weather-beaten saloons, and small, tightly-knit community represented the promise of prosperity and freedom, but it also attracted those who thrived on violence and chaos. This time, however, the threat wasn't coming from raiders or bandits. It was something much more sinister. Sheriff Eli Trask stood on the porch of his office, squinting into the blazing setting sun. The heat clung to the air, making the dust shimmer like the surface of a dying fire. He'd been a lawman for most of his adult life, and over the years, he'd learned to trust his instincts. Something didn't feel right tonight. There was an unnatural stillness in the air. He ran a hand through his thick, graying beard and surveyed the nearly empty street. Red Mesa's residents were finishing their day, retreating indoors as the last glimmer of daylight faded. The rhythmic clink of hammers and the low hum of voices from the saloon filled the air, but the peaceful evening was abruptly shattered by the sound of thundering hooves. From the north, a rider appeared, dust kicking up behind him in a cloud. The horse's legs moved with a desperate speed, its nostrils flaring and eyes wild. The man slumped in the saddle, barely able to hold on, and as the rider grew closer, Eli recognized the lanky figure of Saul Dempsey, one of the local ranchers. "Saul," Eli called out, stepping into the street. The rancher didn't respond. He held on to the reins like a man grasping the edge of a cliff. "What in God's name happened to you?" The horse slowed just enough for Saul to tumble from the saddle and hit the dirt hard. Eli rushed over and helped him to his feet. The man's face was pale as the moon, his eyes wide with terror. "They're coming," Saul gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "The dead, Eli. They're walking." They took the others, tore him apart. Eli blinked, his heart skipping a beat. "What are you talking about?" "Calm down, Saul. You've been out in the sun too long." But Saul shook his head, eyes darting toward the northern edge of town. "No, Sheriff. I ain't crazy. There's something out there, in the woods, and it's coming this way. We've got to run. Get out of here before they get us all." Before Eli could press Saul for more, a scream split the air. A high, piercing wail that came from the edge of town. Mary Lou, the blacksmith's daughter, was standing outside her father's shop, her hands covering her mouth as she stared into the distance. Eli followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. Emerging from the tree line, just beyond the outskirts of town, were figures, moving slow and unsteady, but unmistakably moving toward Red Mesa. At first, they looked like ragged men, vagabonds or prospectors perhaps, but as they drew closer, Eli could see something was horribly wrong. Their skin was ashen, their clothes torn and bloodied, and their eyes, milky and glazed, were fixed on the living souls in Red Mesa. "What in tarnation?" Eli muttered, backing away. "Get inside," he barked to Mary Lou and anyone else nearby. "Now." The young woman didn't need to be told twice, rushing into the shop and slamming the door behind her. Eli turned to Saul, who was still trembling in the dirt. "Get to cover, Saul. I'll get the others." But Saul didn't move, just mumbling to himself, eyes fixed on the approaching nightmare. Eli cursed under his breath, grabbed his rifle from the office, and sprinted toward the saloon where most of the town's men were gathered. Panic was beginning to ripple through the streets as more of the townsfolk spotted the shambling figures approaching. The doors to homes and shops slammed shut. Wooden beams and locks hastily slid into place. Eli burst into the saloon, where a group of cowhands and townsmen were laughing around a poker table, unaware of the impending danger. "Listen up, everyone," Eli shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "We've got trouble, big trouble." The laughter died instantly as all eyes turned to the sheriff. "What kind of trouble, Sheriff?" asked a man named Tobias, a grizzled cattleman with a shotgun leaning against the bar. "The kind you ain't seen before," Eli said, trying to catch his breath. "There's something coming from the woods, dead men, but they're walking, and they're heading straight for Red Mesa." The men exchanged confused glances, unsure whether the sheriff was playing a cruel joke or had lost his mind. Tobias scoffed. "You been drinking, Sheriff?" "I ain't joking," Eli snapped. "Go look for yourselves." Tobias grumbled and got up, peeking out the saloon's swinging doors. His face drained of color as he slowly backed away. What in the hell? Suddenly, the sound of breaking glass and a terrified scream echoed from down the street. "They're here!" shouted a voice from outside. Eli didn't hesitate. "Grab your guns and make for the church. We'll hold up there." Panic spread quickly through the saloon as the men scrambled to grab their weapons. The night outside was now filled with the sound of splintering wood and guttural groans. As Eli rushed outside, he saw one of the undead creatures had made it into the general store, lunging at the shopkeeper, pinning him to the ground. With a quick, practiced motion, Eli leveled his rifle and fired. The bullet tore through the creature's chest, but it barely slowed down. "Headshots, Sheriff. Aim for the head," a voice shouted from behind him. It was Jeremiah Odell, an old prospector who had seen more death than most. His Winchester was already cocked and aimed. He squeezed the trigger, and a shot rang out, taking the creature down with a clean headshot. "Get everyone to the church," Eli ordered. "We ain't gonna last out here." The church stood at the far end of town, its steeple rising high above the other buildings. Eli led the survivors through the streets as the undead closed in from all directions. Their movements were slow, but relentless, and their numbers seemed to swell with each passing moment. The small group made it inside, slamming the doors behind them and barring them with heavy wooden beams. Inside the church, the air was thick with fear. Men, women, and children huddled together, clutching whatever weapons they could find. The groaning and scraping of the undead against the door sent shivers down their spines. "What in God's name are they, Sheriff?" asked Rebecca, the town school teacher. Her hands trembled as she held a rifle, her eyes darting toward the barricaded doors. "I don't know," Eli replied grimly, "but I reckon God's got nothing to do with this." Outside, the pounding grew louder. The wooden planks of the church doors creaked under the weight of the horde. "We ain't gonna hold out forever," Jeremiah muttered. "Not unless we figure out how to stop him." Eli scanned the faces of the survivors. There were about 30 of them, but only a handful had any real experience with firearms. The rest were settlers, ranchers, and women, people unaccustomed to fighting. He needed a plan, and fast. "There's an old mining tunnel," Eli said, thinking aloud. "It runs under the church and leads out past the ridge. If we can make it there, we might have a chance. But we'll never get everyone through before they break in." Doc Parsons exclaimed, his face pale with fear. Eli gritted his teeth. He was right. They didn't have time. The horde was already pressing against the walls, trying to claw their way in. Suddenly, the windows shattered as several undead crawled through, their hands reaching out, desperate for the living flesh inside. Screams filled the air as the survivors scrambled to defend themselves. "Jeremiah, cover the door," Eli shouted. "Rebecca, get those folks down into the cellar." The old prospector took aim and fired, his shots ringing out in quick succession as he picked off the creatures one by one. But for every one they put down, two more seemed to take its place. Rebecca and Eli hurried the survivors toward the hidden hatch beneath the church floor, revealing a narrow tunnel that had once been used to smuggle supplies during the Apache Wars. It was dark, damp, and barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. "I'll go first," Eli said, lowering himself into the tunnel. "Once I'm through, the rest of you follow." One by one, the survivors descended into the darkness, the sounds of gunfire and death echoing from above as Jeremiah and the others held off the undead as long as they could. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls slick with moisture, but Eli pressed on, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The air grew colder the deeper they went, and the tunnel seemed to stretch on forever. The sound of the undead had faded, but a new fear gnawed at Eli's gut. What if the tunnel collapsed? What if the creatures found another way in? Suddenly, the tunnel opened up into a wide cavern, the walls lined with old mining equipment. Eli helped the others through and took a moment to catch his breath, but their relief was short-lived. From the shadows at the far end of the cavern, a new sound emerged, the shuffle of feet and the low, guttural groans of more undead. "They must have come through the mine," Eli muttered, raising his rifle. "We're not out of this yet." With nowhere left to run, Eli and the survivors prepared to make their final stand. There were only a dozen of them left, exhausted, battered, and outnumbered. But they weren't going down without a fight. The undead closed in from all sides, their eyes glowing in the dim lantern light. Eli fired, each shot finding its mark, but it wasn't enough. The creatures kept coming, their hunger insatiable. "We can't hold him," Rebecca shouted, her rifle empty as she backed against the cavern wall. Eli knew she was right, but he wasn't ready to give up. With a final surge of determination, he charged forward, swinging the butt of his rifle like a club, knocking the creatures back. "Come on, you bastards," he roared, firing one last shot into the head of an approaching creature. But even as he fought, Eli knew it was over. The undead swarmed over him, their icy